In 1993, a young Virginia paramedic vanished without a trace after parking her ambulance at a remote trailhead 21 years later. Hikers deep in the Appalachian Mountains discover her faded trauma bag hanging from a lightning-split tree, and what's found inside reignites a cold case that refuses to stay buried. The wind rattled the last stubborn leaves high in the trees as two hikers made their way along an overgrown section of the Appalachian Trail. Late afternoon, light filtered through the branches, slanting gold across the mossy ground. Kevin Turner, a seasoned backpacker, was leading the way when his partner, Melissa Hart, stopped abruptly, her gaze fixed upward. "Kev," she called quietly, pointing toward a jagged oak that had been split years ago by lightning. Tangled among the fractured limbs, swaying gently in the breeze, was something that did not belong. The faded red shape was too square to be part of the tree and too weathered to be new. Kevin squinted, stepping off the trail for a closer look. It was a bag. Not just any bag, but a heavy-duty trauma kit, the kind carried by emergency medical workers. The fabric was bleached from years of sun and rain, straps frayed and stiff with age. A tag still clung stubbornly to one side, its ink ghosted but legible enough to make Melissa's breath hitch, property of Claire Donovan, County EMS. They exchanged a long look, neither speaking at first. Kevin's mind ticked through the implications. That name, it stirred something faint and unsettling, a headline half remembered from years ago. Carefully, he used his trekking pole to lower the bag from its perch, wincing as the weight of it settled into his hands. It was heavier than expected. They set it on the forest floor. Dirt clung to the zippers, but with some effort Melissa managed to open it. Inside were medical supplies frozen in time, gauze packets, scissors, a stethoscope coiled neatly in one corner. Beneath those lay a field dressing stained a rusty brown. There was also a small cassette recorder, its casing warped from moisture, a few leaves stuck to its surface. The air between them seemed to tighten. Kevin closed the bag and stood, scanning the quiet woods as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. The trail was deserted. The only sound was the faint creak of the tree above and their own breathing. "We need to call this in," Melissa said finally, her voice low but urgent. Kevin nodded, taking one last look at the name tag before pulling out his phone. Far from town, the signal flickered weakly, but he managed to connect to emergency services. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew they had stumbled onto the beginning of something much darker than either of them had bargained for. By the time the county deputy arrived, dusk had settled over the forest and a thin mist had begun to curl along the ground. Kevin and Melissa stood off to the side, the trauma bag resting on a patch of cleared earth beneath the oak. The deputy, a tall man with a weathered face and the deliberate movements of someone used to crime scenes, crouched to examine the tag. "You're sure you didn't touch anything inside?" he asked, glancing up at them. Melissa nodded. "We only opened it enough to see the supplies. There was a recorder, some bandages, one of them had blood on it." The deputy's expression tightened. He reached for his radio, murmured a few clipped phrases, then stood. "This name belongs to someone who went missing back in '93, paramedic named Claire Donovan, worked for County EMS." The name landed heavily in the cool air. Kevin felt the weight of it settle in his chest. He remembered the old flyers that used to hang in the gas station window when he was a kid, the smiling woman in uniform, the word "missing" in bold letters across the top. A second vehicle pulled up, headlights cutting through the gathering fog. From it stepped a woman in plain clothes, with a badge clipped to her belt. She introduced herself as Detective Harper, her tone calm but edged with interest. She studied the bag as though it might speak if she stared hard enough. "Where exactly did you find it?" she asked. Melissa pointed to the split oak, its blackened core still visible from the lightning strike. It was wedged high up in the branches, looked like it had been there for years. Harper circled the tree, noting the weather patterns that might have carried debris this far from the trail. She ordered the area taped off and photographed before the evidence techs arrived. When they were done taking initial statements, Harper turned back to the hikers. "This could be important. You might have just reopened a case that's been cold for 2 decades. Kevin glanced once more at the faded red fabric, at the name written in block letters that had survived storms and seasons. In the deepening twilight, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if it too was waiting to see what secrets had just been shaken loose. Detective Harper drove back to the sheriff's substation with the trauma bag secured in an evidence container beside her. The wipers swept across the windshield in slow, rhythmic arcs, clearing the thin drizzle that had begun to fall. She kept glancing at the bag as if half expecting it to shift or speak, its faded fabric carrying the weight of a story that had been silent for too long. Inside the station, she carried it straight to the evidence room, where a technician began photographing every angle before carefully unpacking the contents. The gauze packets were brittle, their edges curling from years of damp air. The stethoscope's tubing had stiffened, and the metal was dulled from exposure. The blood-stained field dressing was placed in a separate sealed bag, the dark rust-colored patch still visible through the plastic. When Harper reached for the cassette recorder, the technician stopped her. "We'll need to get this to the lab as soon as possible. Could be something on it if the tape hasn't degraded completely." She nodded, but her curiosity lingered. She had been a rookie deputy in another county in 1993 and remembered the ripple Claire Donovan's disappearance had caused in every EMS and law enforcement circle in the region. Claire had been young, competent, well-liked. The idea that she could vanish without a trace had unsettled more than just her own department. Harper pulled the old case file from storage later that night. The folder was thick, its edges soft from handling, and the top page bore Claire's smiling photo in her uniform. She studied the details. Last seen leaving her shift, ambulance found locked at a trailhead, no signs of forced entry or struggle. Witness statements from hikers who thought they had heard a woman calling for help, but no one had been located. She traced her finger over the map inside the file, noting the spot where the ambulance had been found and the location where the hikers had discovered the bag. The distance between them was troubling. Steep ridges and deep hollows in between. Leaning back in her chair, Harper felt the pull of something more than just a recovered object. This was a message, left in the canopy of a lonely forest, waiting for someone to listen. And now, after 21 years, it was her turn to hear what it had to say. Erin Donovan was at her kitchen table when the phone rang, the late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds in thin bars of light. She almost didn't answer. After 2 decades, calls from law enforcement had grown rare, and when they did come, they usually carried nothing but another dead end. Still, she picked up, her voice cautious. "Miss Donovan, this is Detective Harper with the Sheriff's Department in Madison County," the voice said. "I'm calling about your sister Claire." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Erin straightened in her chair, fingers tightening around the receiver. "You found her?" There was a pause. "We've recovered an item that belonged to her. A trauma bag with her name tag, found in a remote section of the Appalachian Trail." Erin's pulse quickened. For a moment she pictured her sister walking through the front door, hair damp from the rain, smiling as if the years had never passed, but the reality pressed in quickly. If they had found only a bag, there was still no sign of Claire herself. Harper explained the discovery, the hikers who had spotted it high in the lightning-split oak, the contents inside. She asked Erin to come to the station the following morning to confirm the bag's identification. Erin agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. After hanging up, she sat in silence, staring at the old photo on the wall. Claire stood beside an ambulance in her crisp EMS uniform, stethoscope draped casually around her neck, her smile bright and certain. That photo had been taken only weeks before she vanished. Memories stirred, unspooling in fragments. The sound of Claire's boots on the kitchen floor after a night shift, the smell of coffee brewing before dawn, the way she always carried that trauma bag like an extension of herself. Erin remembered the search in those early days, the endless volunteers combing the ridges, and the way the hope had thinned with each passing week. Now, after 21 years, something tangible had emerged from the silence. Erin pressed her hands flat on the table, grounding herself. She knew tomorrow might bring more questions than answers, But she also knew she would look Detective Harper in the eye and tell her that bag belonged to her sister, and she would not let the case fade back into the shadows again. Morning rain pattered softly against the windshield as Erin pulled into the gravel lot outside the Madison County Sheriff's substation. She had barely slept, her mind circling around images of the faded red trauma bag and the long shadow of what it might mean. Inside, the station smelled faintly of coffee and wet wool. Detective Harper met her at the front desk, offering a firm but sympathetic handshake before leading her to a small evidence room. The bag sat on a metal table beneath bright overhead lights. Even from the doorway, Erin felt a jolt of recognition. The canvas was sun-bleached and frayed, but the shape, the scuff, marks along the bottom, and the way the straps were knotted to make them shorter were all unmistakable. Harper stepped aside, letting Erin approach. Her fingers hovered above the fabric before she finally rested her hand on it. The texture was rough and cold from the damp air in the room. She traced the faded ink on the name tag, Claire Donovan, County EMS. For a moment, she was back in 1993, watching her sister stride out the door with this very bag swinging at her side. "This was hers," Erin said quietly, her voice catching. "No doubt." Harper nodded and gestured to the items laid out beside it. The stethoscope, stiff with age, the gauze packets. The field dressing stained a deep brown. Erin's gaze caught on the small cassette recorder. She remembered Claire sometimes used one to dictate notes after particularly complex calls, though she had never heard the tapes herself. "We're having the audio analyzed," Harper explained. "There may be something recorded that day." Erin swallowed hard. The thought of hearing her sister's voice after all these years sent a shiver down her spine. Harper closed the evidence log and walked Erin back to the lobby. "Finding this means something," she said. "It tells us she was deeper into those woods than we thought, and someone else may have been there with her." Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. Erin stood by her car for a long moment before getting in. She could feel the weight of the bag still in her palm, as if she had carried it herself. Whatever secrets it held, she knew one thing with certainty: she was ready to hear them. The lab's audio specialist sat in a dim, soundproof room, the cassette recorder from Claire's bag resting beside a tangle of wires and equipment. Years of moisture had warped the tape, but with careful cleaning and splicing, the first faint sounds began to emerge. Detective Harper watched from the doorway, arms folded, her gaze fixed on the rotating reels. At first, it was only static, the kind that comes from decades of silence. Then, a woman's voice, strained but steady, broke through. "Female, late 20s, found on trail, appears disoriented, refusing transport." There was a pause, followed by muffled movement and the rustle of leaves. Another voice entered, lower and rougher, the tone edged with hostility. "Turn that off." The words were faint, but clear enough to draw a look between Harper and the technician. Claire's voice returned, more cautious now. "Sir, I just need to check your vitals." The man's reply was inaudible, swallowed by a burst of static, and then the recording ended abruptly. Harper leaned over the console. "That last part, can you clean it up?" The technician nodded, replaying the final seconds, adjusting levels, filtering out background hiss. The man's voice came through again, just enough to catch fragments. "No one needs to know you were here." The sentence cut off, as if the recorder had been switched off mid-word. Harper left the lab with a copy of the audio in her hand and a heaviness in her chest. This was no simple disappearance. Someone had been with Claire. Someone she clearly did not know well. The aggression in his voice was unmistakable. She drove to the archive room and began combing through the original witness statements from 1993. A few hikers had reported seeing a man in an EMS jacket near the trailhead that day, but none had been able to identify him. One statement in particular caught her attention. A park ranger recalled an off-duty EMS worker visiting the trail 2 days earlier, asking about remote paths that rarely saw foot traffic. His name had been noted, but he had never been considered a serious suspect. Harper tapped her pen against the page, the echo of the man's voice from the tape replaying in her mind. If this was the same person, he had been planning something long before Claire vanished. And now, after 21 years, his voice was finally on record. Erin sat in her living room that evening, the copy of the old case file spread out across her coffee table. Detective Harper had dropped it off earlier, along with a USB drive containing the recovered audio. She had not pressed Erin to listen, only said it might help her understand what had happened in those final moments before her sister disappeared. The rain outside had turned to a steady patter, soft against the windows. Erin stared at the small speaker connected to her laptop, her finger hovering over the play button. When she finally pressed it, static filled the room, the sound brittle and distant, like a voice carried across decades. Then came Claire's voice. Calm but firm, her tone familiar in a way that struck deep. Erin's eyes stung as she listened. Female, late 20s, found on trail, appears disoriented. Her sister's breathing quickened on the recording, followed by the rustle of movement. The male voice cut in, low and sharp. Turn that off. Even after all these years, the menace in it was unmistakable. Erin leaned closer, as if her proximity could force the man to reveal himself. Claire's reply was quieter now, careful. "Sir, I just need to check your vitals." Another garbled response, then the chilling fragment. "No one needs to know you were here." The tape clicked off. Erin sat frozen, her heart pounding. She had always imagined Claire's last moments as sudden, perhaps accidental, but this was deliberate. Someone had been there, someone who didn't want her found. When the knock at the door came, she startled. Detective Harper stood in the rain, coat darkened at the shoulders. "I wanted to let you know," she said as Erin ushered her inside. "We've matched a partial fingerprint from the bag to a man who worked part-time at County EMS in the early 90s. He left the area not long after Claire went missing." Erin's stomach turned. "Do you have a name?" "We do," Harper said, her voice steady. "But before we go knocking on doors, we need more than a print and an old tape. If he's our man, he's been hiding for 21 years. I don't want to give him a reason to run now." Erin glanced toward the speaker, the room still heavy with the echo of her sister's voice. "Then let's make sure he doesn't." Detective Harper sat alone at her desk, long after most of the station had gone quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, casting pale reflections across the spread of photographs, maps, and yellowed witness statements in front of her. At the center of it all was the name she could not ignore, Mark Hanlon. He had been 24 in 1993, working as an EMT on a part-time rotation. His personnel file showed no disciplinary actions, no complaints, but his departure from County EMS had been abrupt. According to a brief note in the archives, he claimed he was relocating for family reasons and never returned. Harper traced her finger over his old ID photo, noting the sharp jawline, the narrow eyes. Time would have changed him, but there was something about the gaze that felt guarded, almost calculating. She clicked through database searches, piecing together fragments of his life after leaving Virginia. A few short-term addresses in North Carolina, a brief stint working construction in Tennessee, then a long gap in the record. It wasn't until 5 years ago that his name surfaced again on a property deed for a small cabin in rural West Virginia. Harper leaned back, weighing her options. She could drive out there tomorrow, knock on his door, and see what surfaced in his expression when Claire Donovan's name was spoken. But instinct told her to hold back. If Hanlon had evaded suspicion for 2 decades, he would not be careless now. Instead, she called in a favor from a contact in the state police, requesting discreet surveillance on the cabin. If he was still there, she wanted to know his patterns before making a move. When she finally shut down her computer, the room felt colder, the silence heavier. She locked the case file in her drawer and stepped outside. Rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and sharp with the scent of pine. Across town, Erin sat by her kitchen window, staring at the darkened street. She didn't know the man's name yet, but she felt his presence all the same, as if he were a shadow just out of sight. Somewhere, he had lived with the knowledge of what happened to her sister, and she sensed that the time he had left to keep it hidden was slipping away. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow gravel road, hidden behind a stand of pines that swayed in the late autumn wind. From the hill above, State Trooper Wade Ellison watched through a pair of binoculars, his patrol truck parked far enough back to stay out of sight. Detective Harper had been clear in her instructions. Observe, record, and wait. Through the glass, he saw movement inside. A man stepped into view, taller now than in the grainy ID photo, his hair threaded with gray but his frame still lean. He moved with the deliberate ease of someone who lived alone, unhurried. As he poured coffee into a chipped mug, Wade jotted down the time in his notebook. An old pickup was parked beside the cabin, its bed stacked with firewood. The plates were West Virginia tags, registered under a different name than Mark Hanlon. Harper had suspected he might be using an alias, and this confirmed it. Hours passed with little activity, just the quiet rhythm of rural life. The man split wood for a while, then disappeared inside again. It was near dusk when Wade caught the first sign that something was off. The man emerged, carrying a small duffel bag, glanced up and down the empty road, and loaded it into the truck. His movements were brisk now, purposeful. Wade raised his radio but hesitated. Harper had wanted a full picture of his habits before they approached. Still, the unease in his gut was growing. He noted the make and model of the truck, the direction it faced, the faint glow of the dashboard as the engine turned over. Back at the station, Harper was reviewing the old park ranger's statement when her phone buzzed. Wade's voice came through low and steady. "He's on the move, heading north, got a bag with him." Harper grabbed her coat, already thinking ahead. If Hanlon was leaving the cabin overnight, this might be the opening they needed to get inside without tipping him off. She told Wade to keep his distance but stay on him until she called back. In the gathering dark, the truck's taillights disappeared around the bend. For the first time in 21 years, the man tied to Claire Donovan's last known moments was in motion, and Harper intended to follow that trail until it ended. Harper arrived at the cabin just after nightfall, her headlights cutting a pale path along the gravel drive before she killed the engine and coasted to a stop. The surrounding woods pressed in close, the branches shifting in the cold wind. She stepped out quietly, her boots sinking into the damp earth, and approached the front porch with a flashlight held low. The door was locked, as she expected. She moved to the side, scanning the windows. A narrow one near the back was cracked at the frame, the wood swollen and warped from years of weather. With a careful push, it gave just enough for her to slip inside. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something older, a stale, musty odor that seemed to cling to the walls. Her flashlight swept over a small kitchen, a cluttered table, and a single worn armchair facing an unlit fireplace. A pot of coffee sat cold on the counter, half full. She moved deeper into the cabin, her steps soundless on the creaking floor. In the bedroom, a single bed was neatly made, the corners tucked with military precision. A duffel bag lay open at the foot, empty. The closet held only a few shirts and jackets, but it was the bottom shelf that caught her attention. A plastic storage bin sat pushed to the back. She pulled it out slowly, her pulse quickening. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, some faded to near sepia, others more recent. Many showed wooded trails, rocky overlooks, and rushing streams. But sprinkled among them were portraits of people, men, women, and children, snapped at odd angles, often unaware they were being photographed. At the bottom was a smaller box wrapped in an old towel. Harper unwrapped it to reveal a cassette recorder identical to the one found in Claire's bag, along with several unlabeled tapes. She slipped them into her evidence satchel, her mind already turning over what they might contain. A faint noise from outside made her freeze. Tires on gravel. She crossed quickly to the back window, eased it open, and slipped into the shadows of the trees. From her position, she watched the headlights crest the drive. The old pickup rolled to a stop, and Mark Hanlon stepped out, scanning the darkness, as if he sensed the air around his secrets had just shifted. Hanlon lingered by the truck for a moment, his breath clouding in the cold air. Harper stayed low behind a fallen log, her pulse steady but her grip tight around the flashlight she no longer dared to switch on. The faint creak of the cabin's porch steps carried through the stillness as he mounted them and unlocked the door. Light spilled briefly across the yard before the door closed, leaving only the dim outline of the windows. From her position, Harper could hear faint movement inside. A chair scraped against the floor. The metallic click of a lighter. The smell of cigarette smoke drifted into the night, mingling with the scent of damp pine. She waited, counting heartbeats, until she saw him pass one of the windows, his head tilted as if he were listening for something beyond the cabin walls. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. Wade's message was brief. Parked 2 miles down, eyes on the road. She typed back a single confirmation, never taking her eyes off the cabin. Inside, Hanlon began moving quickly. She caught glimpses of him packing items into a duffel, the same bag he had left with earlier, now returning with purpose. A stack of envelopes disappeared into it, followed by what looked like a folded map. He paused at the table, pulled a small object from his pocket, and stared at it for several seconds before tucking it away. Harper couldn't see what it was, but his stillness in that moment sent a ripple of unease through her. He moved toward the back of the cabin, out of view. Harper shifted silently, circling through the trees to gain a better angle. A window near the bedroom gave her a partial glimpse. Hanlon crouched at the open closet, his hands buried in the plastic bin where the photographs had been. She saw his expression tighten as he searched, his movements growing sharper. When he straightened, the bin was empty. Harper's breath caught. He knew something was missing. He stood in the center of the room for a long moment, then turned toward the window, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. Harper sank lower behind the trunk of a pine, every muscle taut. The quiet between them felt like the moment before a wire snaps thin, stretched, and ready to break. Hanlon moved away from the window, but his unease seemed to hang in the air long after he disappeared from view. Harper stayed pressed against the rough bark of the pine, watching for any shift in light or movement. Minutes passed. Then the sound came, faint but distinct, the back door opening. She edged along the tree line, keeping low, until she saw him step out into the yard. His shoulders were hunched, his head turning slowly, as if trying to feel the night around him. He carried a flashlight in one hand, but instead of sweeping it across the woods, he kept the beam fixed low to the ground. Harper realized he was following tracks, her tracks. She had been careful, but the damp soil might have betrayed her. Hanlon crouched once, studying the earth, then straightened and began walking toward the edge of the trees. Her pulse quickened. The distance between them was closing. She eased backward, moving as quietly as she could, until the trunks thickened and swallowed the cabin from view. In the faint glow of his flashlight, she saw his face, older, harder than the photo in her file, but with the same narrow eyes that seemed to cut through whatever they fixed on. A sharp crack of a branch under her boot froze them both. His light jerked up, slicing through the dark. Harper dropped into a crouch behind a tangle of brush, holding her breath as the beam swept past. For a long moment the woods went still. Then he turned abruptly and headed back toward the cabin, his pace faster now. From a distance, Harper watched him slam the back door and kill the lights inside. The house sank into shadow, its windows reflecting only the pale outline of the moon. She waited another 10 minutes before moving, retracing her route to the narrow service road where her car was parked. Once inside, she sat for a moment, her hands gripping the wheel. She had the tapes, the photographs, and a name that finally had weight behind it. But tonight had shifted something. Hanlon knew someone had been inside. And now, more than ever, she was certain he would not stay in one place for long. The next morning, Harper sat across from Aaron in a quiet corner of the sheriff's office, the early light spilling in pale and cold through the blinds. Between them on the table sat a small evidence box. Harper rested her hand on it, her expression measured. "I went into his cabin last night," she said. "It was risky, but I brought these back." She slid the box toward Aaron, who hesitated before opening it. Inside were the photographs, their edges curling with age, and the second cassette recorder. Aaron picked up one of the pictures and felt her stomach tighten. It showed Claire, standing beside her ambulance, head turned towards someone just out of frame. The shot was slightly blurred, but her smile was clear, as if she had no idea she was being photographed. "There are others," Harper said quietly. "Not just of Claire, men, women, children, all in outdoor settings. Some of these may connect him to other disappearances." Erin set the photo down, her hands trembling. "So it's him. You're certain now?" Harper nodded. "We have enough to make a move, but it's better if we wait until he slips up. He's careful. Last night he knew someone had been in his place. He'll either run or try to cover his tracks. Either way, it will give us a window." Erin's jaw tightened. "And if he disappears again?" "That's the risk," Harper admitted. "But the more we learn before we bring him in, the harder it will be for him to wriggle out." They sat in silence for a moment, the low hum of the building filling the space between them. Erin reached into the box again and lifted the cassette recorder, feeling the cold weight of it in her palm. "If there's her voice on here," she said, "I want to hear it." "You will," Harper promised. "But first we get it to the lab. We need whatever's on that tape to stand up in court." Erin closed the lid of the box and pushed it back across the table. "Then let's make sure we finish this. No more 20-year waits." Harper met her eyes, the quiet resolve between them needing no further words. They both knew the clock had started ticking. The forensic audio lab was tucked into the basement of a state police annex, its walls lined with racks of equipment that hummed softly. Harper stood beside the lead technician, a wiry man with steady hands and a habit of leaning close to the console as if the sound itself might whisper something to him. On the table sat the cassette recorder from Hanlon's cabin, its casing scratched but intact. He slid the tape into a specialized deck and pressed play. At first there was only the familiar hiss of aged magnetic tape, then a faint shuffle of footsteps on gravel. Claire's voice came next, faint but recognizable, her tone calm and professional. "Male, approximately 30, found on trail near mile marker 21, refusing evacuation." There was a pause, then the man's voice, unmistakably the same one from the earlier tape. "You shouldn't be here." His tone was low, the words deliberate, as though meant for her alone. Claire's voice didn't falter. "Sir, I just need to—" A sudden crash of static drowned her out, followed by the sound of scuffling, heavy breathing, and a brief metallic clatter that could have been the recorder striking the ground. The man's voice came again, closer now, edged with something sharper. "This doesn't have to get worse." The recording cut abruptly, the tape stopping with a soft click. The technician sat back, adjusting his glasses. "That's all there is. No date stamp, but based on tape wear, this is likely from the day she disappeared." Harper kept her gaze on the console, the final words still echoing in her mind. It was more than enough to place him with her that day, and the tone in his voice made it clear it had not been a chance encounter. She left the lab with a copy of the audio, the cold weight of certainty settling deeper in her chest. Driving back toward the station, she called Erin. "We have him on tape with her," she said. Erin was silent for a long moment. "Then we're closer than we've ever been." Harper looked at the road stretching ahead, the winter light pale against the trees. Closer, yes, but close enough to catch him before he vanished again was another question entirely. Harper sat in her office, with the blinds half drawn, the audio from the second tape looping softly through her computer speakers. Each time she heard Claire's voice, steady but edged with caution, the knot in her chest tightened. The man's words measured, threatening, were proof of intent, but she needed more, enough to bring charges that would hold, even after 2 decades. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Wade stepped in, brushing rain from his jacket. "He's moving again," he said. "Left the cabin early this morning, headed east. Stopped for gas, bought supplies. Looks like he's stocking up for a trip." Harper pushed back from her desk. "How far ahead is he?" "Not much. We've kept him in sight, but he's taking back roads. Could be heading toward the state line." She grabbed her coat and evidence satchel. "If he's running, we don't let him get past us, but we also can't push him into disappearing for another 20 years. By the time they reached the highway, the rain had thickened to a cold drizzle. Wade's voice came over the radio from the trailing vehicle. "He's pulling into a roadside diner. Looks like he's meeting someone." Harper eased her car onto the shoulder, far enough to stay unnoticed. Through the binoculars, she saw Hanlon step out of his truck, the duffel slung over one shoulder. A man in a dark jacket emerged from the diner's side door, and the two exchanged a brief, tense handshake. Something passed between them too small to identify from this distance, but the way Hanlon kept glancing over his shoulder set her on edge. After a few minutes, they parted. The stranger went back inside, and Hanlon returned to his truck, placing the duffel carefully in the cab. Wade's voice came again. "Do we follow the other guy?" "Not yet," Harper said. "Hanlon's our priority. If he's passing something off, I want to know where he goes next." She watched as the truck pulled away, its taillights vanishing into the gray morning. Somewhere ahead lay the answers to Claire Donovan's last day. And with each mile he drove, Harper knew the moment to act was coming fast, the margin for patience narrowing with every turn of the road. The road wound through low, mist-shrouded hills, the drizzle softening the outlines of barns and bare-limbed trees. Harper kept 2 cars behind Hanlon, her eyes fixed on the dull red of his truck through the wavering haze. Every so often he would slow, scanning the rearview mirror, as if measuring the distance between himself and whoever might be following. When he finally turned onto a narrow gravel lane, Harper let Wade's unmarked SUV slip ahead to take the lead on surveillance. She pulled off onto a sidetrack, cutting the engine. From her vantage point, she could see the lane curve between thick stands of pine before disappearing into shadow. Wade's voice crackled over the radio. "He stopped at an old service shed about half a mile in. Looks abandoned." Harper stepped out into the damp air, the scent of wet earth strong around her. She moved along the tree line until she could see the shed, its corrugated roof sagging, walls streaked with rust. Hanlon's truck sat off to one side, the driver's door open. He was inside the shed, a dim figure moving among stacks of dusty crates. Through the binoculars, she caught the glint of something metallic in his hands, a small lockbox. He pried it open and sifted through its contents, then slipped several items into his coat pocket. When he emerged, he scanned the woods in a slow, deliberate arc, his gaze lingering on the darker edges where she stood. Harper stayed perfectly still, her breath shallow. After a moment, he closed the truck door and started the engine. The sound echoed in the quiet, carrying a strange finality. "Wade," she murmured into the radio. "Don't let him out of your sight. I want to see where he takes that box." The truck rumbled back down the lane, and Harper waited until the sound faded before stepping toward the shed. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil and mildew. Dust coated every surface, except for a clear space on a workbench where the lockbox had been. Nearby, a faded topographic map lay pinned under a rusted wrench, its edges curling. A single trail was marked in red ink, leading deep into the mountains. The date scrawled beside it made her chest tighten. May 17, 1993. Harper traced the red line on the map with her fingertip, following its path from the old service shed into a tangle of switchbacks and unmarked ridges. The trail ended at a small X drawn in the corner of a steep ravine. The date beside it sat like a weight in her mind. It was the same week Claire Donovan disappeared. She photographed the map from several angles before carefully rolling it up and sliding it into her evidence satchel. Outside, the drizzle had eased to a faint mist, the air carrying the faint rush of water from somewhere deeper in the hills. She glanced down the gravel lane, but Wade's voice over the radio confirmed Hanlon was still in motion, now heading west. Harper locked the shed behind her, more out of habit than necessity, and hiked back to her car. As she drove to rejoin Wade, she kept replaying the image of Hanlon in the shed, the way he had looked toward the tree line before leaving. He was a man aware of every shadow around him, and that awareness meant he was protecting something. By the time she caught up, Wade had pulled onto the shoulder of a quiet back road. He leaned against his SUV, binoculars in hand, watching the red truck parked outside a weathered cabin farther up the slope. "He's been inside for about 10 minutes, Wade said. "Place looks like it's been empty for years." Harper studied the cabin. The roof sagged in places, but the front porch was swept clean. No sign of forced entry. She imagined Hanlon moving through its rooms, checking whatever he had hidden there. The lockbox from the shed could already be inside, its contents concealed again. They stayed in position until Hanlon emerged, locking the door behind him and heading back to his truck. He didn't look around this time. He simply got in, started the engine, and drove off toward the valley. Wade lowered the binoculars. "We going in?" "Not yet," Harper said. "If that trail on the map leads to the ravine, this cabin might be our staging point. We search it when we have a warrant." As the sound of Hanlon's engine faded, Harper's gaze drifted back to the cabin door. Whatever was behind it, she was certain, was tied to the last hours of Claire Donovan's life. That night, the rain returned in steady sheets, blurring the outlines of the valley and turning the back roads into slick ribbons of mud and gravel. Harper sat in her car outside the station, the wipers keeping time as she listened to the soft hiss of the tires in the distance on the police scanner. Hanlon's truck had been spotted in the next county, parked for an hour outside a small general store before disappearing north. Inside the station, Erin was waiting with the printed photographs spread across a table. She had circled faces with a red marker, connecting them with thin lines of ink that branched like a web. "I think some of these were taken in the same location," Erin said quietly, tapping at two images of wooded trails. "Look at the ridgeline in the background. Same curve, same tree line. Could be the place marked on your map." Harper leaned in, studying the subtle details. She could see it now, the faint outline of the ravine walls in the distance. Claire's photograph was among them, her ambulance visible only as a sliver of white beyond the trees. "We need to get eyes on that spot," Harper said. "If he's been going back there, it's for a reason." Erin hesitated, her fingers tightening on the photo. "If we find something, are you ready for that?" Harper met her gaze, the weight of the years reflected in both their expressions. "We have to be." By dawn, the rain had eased to a mist again. Wade was already at the trailhead when Harper arrived, the rolled map on the hood of his SUV. They traced the red-marked path, estimating the hike would take them deep into the hills, well past any maintained routes. The forest was still damp from the night's storm, the air cool and heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, the only sounds their boots on the softened trail and the occasional drip of water from the canopy above. As they reached the first overlook, Harper paused, scanning the ravine below. Somewhere in that tangle of shadow and stone lay the X from the map, a place Hanlon had marked more than 2 decades ago. The thought settled cold in her chest. Whatever they found there could end this search, but it might also confirm the worst fears that had haunted Erin for 21 years. The trail narrowed as it descended, forcing Harper and Wade to move single file along a slick, rocky slope. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint roar of water from somewhere below. Ferns brushed against their legs, their fronds heavy with droplets that fell in steady rhythms onto the forest floor. Harper glanced at the map again, noting the sharp bend in the red line that should lead them directly toward the X. They reached a flat shelf of rock overlooking the ravine. From here, the land dropped steeply into a shadowed cut where a stream churned over boulders. Across the gap, the opposite bank rose in jagged tiers, and halfway up, Harper saw a tree split clean down the middle by lightning, its pale interior stark against the darker wood around it. Something hung from one of the high branches, swaying faintly in the breeze. Wade lifted his binoculars. "That's it," he murmured. "Looks like a bag. Old canvas, maybe green once, but it's faded to almost gray." Harper's pulse quickened. "We're going down." The descent was slow and treacherous, the rocks slick beneath their boots. At the bottom, the sound of the stream was louder, echoing off the walls of the ravine. They crossed at a shallow point, the cold water rushing around their ankles, and began the climb toward the lightning-split tree. Up close, the bag was unmistakable, a paramedic's trauma kit, the same make and style used by Claire Donovan's unit in 1993. The strap had caught in a fork of the branch, weathered and frayed but still intact. Harper stood beneath it, the damp air pressing close, and for a long moment she simply stared. Wade climbed partway up and eased the bag free. It was heavier than expected. When he handed it down, Harper felt the solid weight shift inside. Mud and pine needles clung to the canvas, and the zipper was stiff from years of exposure. She opened it carefully. Inside were medical supplies long expired, a small spiral-bound notebook, and a cassette tape wrapped in plastic. The notebook's first page bore Claire's handwriting, still legible despite the years. Harper turned it over in her hands, the inked lines trembling slightly where the pen had pressed harder, as if she had been writing in haste. The forest around them felt utterly still, as if even the wind was waiting to hear what those pages might reveal. Harper held the notebook as if it might crumble in her hands, the damp pages curling at the edges. She eased it open to the first entry. The handwriting was hurried, the strokes uneven, as if written under stress. "Dispatch to mile marker 21, it began. Male subject refusing medical assistance. Seems agitated, keeps watching the tree line, says someone is following him." Harper read silently, her eyes tracking each line. The entry shifted abruptly. Subject turned hostile. Tried to take the radio. "I've moved off the trail to get distance. We'll circle back to the ambulance when it's safe." Wade stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the page. "That's the last we have of her movements," he said quietly. The following entries were brief, scattered notes. Fragments of a location description. A mention of rain starting. One final line that made Harper's chest tighten. "If anyone finds this, tell Aaron I didn't stop trying." Harper closed the notebook, the weight of it more than just its damp paper. She slid it carefully into her satchel, alongside the cassette wrapped in plastic. Wade glanced toward the ravine's edge. "We should get this back before the weather turns again." The climb out was slower, the mud giving way underfoot in slick patches. By the time they reached the ridge, clouds were stacking along the horizon, heavy with the promise of more rain. Harper paused once more to look back at the lightning-split tree, its pale wound bright against the dark hillside. It felt like a marker, left for someone to find long after the moment had passed. At the trailhead, they loaded the evidence into Wade's SUV. The drive back to the station was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the silence that neither of them seemed ready to break. Harper's fingers brushed the edge of the satchel, the presence of the notebook and tape a constant reminder of how close they were to the truth. When they arrived, Aaron was already waiting. Harper placed the satchel on the table between them without a word. Aaron opened it slowly, her breath catching as she saw the handwriting. She traced her fingers over the ink, her voice barely above a whisper. She was still fighting, and for the first time, Harper felt certain they could finish what Claire had started. The cassette from the bag was sent to the same forensic lab that had processed the earlier tapes. Harper and Aaron stood in the small, dimly lit room as the technician prepared the deck, the scent of old electronics and cleaning solvent hanging in the air. The plastic wrap had preserved the tape better than expected, and when the reels began to turn, the sound that emerged was startlingly clear. At first, there was only the sound of footsteps over wet ground, steady but quick, and the faint rustle of fabric as Claire adjusted the bag on her shoulder. Her breathing was even, but the pace suggested she was moving fast. Then came her voice, low and urgent. "Subject has followed me off trail. No radio signal, heading toward ravine." A man's voice answered, faint at first, then sharper. "You're making a mistake." Claire's reply was defiant. "Stay back." There was a pause, followed by the snap of a branch and a muffled thud, as if the recorder had been jostled. The sound of water grew louder, and then Claire's voice again, closer to the microphone. "If anyone hears this, I'm not lost. I was chased." The words were cut short by a heavy splash, the sound echoing before the tape dissolved into static. The technician stopped the deck and leaned back. "That's all there is. It matches the handwriting in the notebook almost perfectly. She knew someone might find this." Aaron's hand covered her mouth, her eyes glassy but focused. Harper felt the same mix of grief and resolve pressing in on her. The tape was no longer just evidence. It was a message Claire had fought to leave behind. Back at the station, Harper placed the notebook and the newly digitized audio into a secure evidence file. Every piece pointed to Hanlon, and with the trail on the map and the matching photographs, they had a framework strong enough to take to the district attorney. Outside, the late afternoon sky was heavy with clouds, the air tense with the promise of another storm. Harper stood on the steps, the weight of the satchel at her side, and knew the window to act was closing. If Hanlon sensed what they had, he would vanish again. This time, she could not let that happen. The district attorney's office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, its narrow windows letting in only a thin wash of gray light. Harper spread the evidence across the long table in the conference room, each piece sealed and labeled. The map from the shed, the photographs, the original audio tape from the cabin, the cassette from the bag, and Claire's notebook all lay in careful order. The DA, a sharp-eyed woman named Marla Klein, examined each item without speaking. She played both recordings twice, her fingers steepled under her chin. When the second tape ended, she leaned back in her chair. "This is strong," she said finally, "but it's circumstantial until we can place him in that ravine or link him directly to her disappearance." Harper met her gaze. "He marked the location on the map. He's returned to it more than once. He had possession of items matching what was found with her bag. How much more do we need before we act?" Marla tapped her pen against the edge of the table. "Enough to make sure this doesn't fall apart in court. I'll authorize a search warrant for the cabin. If he's been using it as a stash site, something there could give us the connection." By the time Harper returned to the station, the warrant was approved. Wade was waiting in the lot, the winter wind cutting between the buildings. "Hanlon's still on the move," he said. "Southbound now. If we're quick, we can get into that cabin before he circles back." They drove in silence, the patrol SUVs following a mile behind to avoid drawing attention. The hills were pale under the overcast sky, the trees skeletal against the fading light. When they reached the cabin, Harper's boots crunched on frost as she stepped onto the porch. The lock gave way with a firm twist of the key provided by the warrant team. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of wood smoke. A thin layer of dust covered most surfaces except for a table in the corner where maps and small metal tins were stacked neatly. Harper's eyes caught on something under the table, a plastic storage crate with a faded county EMS sticker. Her pulse quickened as she knelt to open it. Inside, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a folded paramedic's jacket with Claire Donovan's name patch still stitched above the breast pocket. Harper lifted the jacket from the crate, the fabric stiff with age and faintly smelling of mildew. The name patch was dulled but still legible, each letter a reminder that Claire had worn it on her last shift. Beneath it lay more items wrapped in oilcloth, a pair of shears, a flashlight with corroded batteries, and a laminated ID card, the photo of Claire smiling in uniform. The sight of it made Harper's throat tighten. Wade moved to the table, flipping through the stack of maps. "Look at this," he said, sliding one toward her. It was another topographic chart, this one marked with a series of red X's scattered through the mountains. The handwriting matched the first map from the shed. "These aren't random," Wade added. "They could be other locations he's used." Harper placed the items back into evidence bags, each seal pressed tight. Every piece was another thread tying Hanlon to Claire's disappearance, and now they had physical possession of her uniform and identification. It was more than a breadcrumb, it was a direct line. A noise from outside snapped their attention to the window. The sound of gravel under tires cut through the cold air. Wade's expression shifted. "That's him." Harper's pulse surged. They moved quickly, shutting off their flashlights. Through the narrow gap in the curtain, she saw Hanlon's truck roll to a stop in the yard. He climbed out slowly, his gaze sweeping the porch before moving toward the door. She signaled to the patrol units waiting down the road. Within moments, headlights flared and tires crunched closer, the sound growing louder until two SUVs pulled in behind the truck. Officers spilled out, their voices sharp in the stillness. Hanlon froze, his hand halfway to the cabin door. "Marcus Hanlon," one of the officers called. "You're under arrest." His eyes flicked toward the window where Harper stood, and for a moment there was no anger, only a calculating stillness. Then he stepped back, letting the officers close in. The cuffs clicked into place, the sound oddly final in the cold mountain air. Harper stepped onto the porch as they led him to the SUV. The box of evidence sat just inside the door, waiting to be cataloged. She knew the fight in court was still ahead, but for the first time in 21 years, the man who had last seen Claire Donovan alive was no longer free. The interview room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead light. Hanlon sat at the metal table, his wrists still cuffed, his posture loose in a way that felt practiced. Harper took the seat across from him, placing a single evidence bag in the center of the table. Inside was Claire's laminated ID card, the corners worn, her smiling face frozen in time. Hanlon's eyes flicked to it, then back to Harper. "Never seen it before," he said, his voice even. She leaned forward slightly. "It was in your cabin, along with her uniform, along with 2 maps marking the ravine where her bag was found. You've been going back there for years. Why?" His expression barely shifted. "I hike. Those hills are public land. You can't tie me to something that happened 2 decades ago." Harper let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing into the narrow room. Then she slid a small recorder across the table and pressed play. Claire's voice filled the space, low and urgent, the sound of water in the background. "If anyone hears this, I'm not lost. I was chased." Hanlon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Harper watched the flicker of tension in his shoulders. "That's her voice," she said quietly. "She was talking about you." For the first time, his gaze broke from hers, drifting toward the corner of the room. It was not a confession, but it was enough for her to know he recognized every word. Hours later, when the formal interview concluded, Harper stepped into the hallway where Erin waited. She handed over a copy of the notebook and the recording. Erin held them close, her voice trembling. "I can finally stop wondering." The case would now move into the courts, but for Harper, the weight had shifted. They had pulled something tangible out of the shadows, something Claire had fought to leave behind. As Hanlon was led past in chains, the winter air spilled into the hallway, carrying the sharp scent of pine from the hills beyond town. Harper watched him step into the transport van, the door closing with a hollow finality. The long search was not over, but the man at the center of it was no longer free to walk back into the woods. The trial began in early spring, the courthouse steps lined with reporters and townspeople who had followed the case for decades. Harper took the stand on the 3rd day, her testimony steady as she walked the jury through each piece of evidence. The maps, the recordings, the jacket with Claire's name patch, and the paramedic bag hanging in that lightning-split tree all formed a chain that could no longer be ignored. Erin sat in the gallery every day, her hands folded in her lap, the notebook resting on the bench beside her. When Claire's voice played for the jury, the room went still. Even the court reporter paused for a moment, her fingers hovering above the keys. Hanlon's defense tried to erode the connections, claiming coincidence and contamination over the years, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When the verdict was read, Erin closed her eyes and let out a breath she had been holding for 21 years, guilty on all counts. After the sentencing, Harper walked out into the crisp afternoon light. The sky was a pale blue, the air carrying the faint scent of thawing earth. Erin was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. She handed Harper a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of Claire in uniform, her hair pulled back, smiling at the camera. On the back, in neat handwriting, Erin had written, "For bringing her home." Harper looked at the photo for a long moment before tucking it safely into her coat. They talked quietly for a while, their voices blending with the hum of traffic and the chatter of people filtering out of the courthouse. That evening, Harper drove out to the edge of the mountains, parking near the trailhead where Claire's last shift had begun. The trees were still bare, their branches etched against the fading sky. She stood for a while, listening to the stream below, the sound steady and unchanging, as if time had not touched it. The search was over. Claire's story would no longer be a question whispered in the dark. It would be told in court records, in the memories of those who had loved her, and in the quiet resolve of the people who had refused to stop looking.